Romans chapter 4, let me read this to you. Let's start in verse 13. He says, "For the promise that he should be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." Now let me stop here and say this. Galatians chapter 3, verse 29. We're going to go to Galatians here in just a minute. We're not going to read the 29th verse, but Galatians 3:29 says, if you be Christ, if you're born again, if you're a child of God, if you be Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Okay, since you're born again and born of Him, since you be of Christ, you're Abraham's seed. So since you're Abraham's seed, let's read this verse again. For the promise that he should be heir of the world. Heir of what? The world. Let that soak in just a minute. Not just heir of one city, not just heir of one state or one little community, not just heir of several acres of land. No, the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed. Galatians 3:29, if you be Christ, then are you Abraham's seed. Now this is talking to you. For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise of none effect. Here's something about faith, and we'll see this here in just a minute in Galatians, the 3rd chapter, because Paul says the same thing here. The law is not of faith. Has nothing to do with faith. And right here we see that God was saying that the promise that Abraham would be heir of the world was not through the law. The law was not yet given. We know that the law came through Moses. You can see that in the Gospel of John chapter 1. Okay? But here, Abraham, which is the father of faith to us all, I'm talking about to the church, to us, it says right here, the promise that he would be heir was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Notice it says right here in verse 13, for the promise. For the promise. What God had spoke to Abraham and what God called him and what God said to him about him was not through the law or of the law, but it was through a promise. Okay? That's very important because the law is not of faith. It has to be by promise. God had to give us a promise. God had to give us exceeding great and precious promises that through the promises we can partake of God's divine nature. Because if it was through the law, my brother and sister, we wouldn't qualify. We would never get to experience God's highest and best if we had to go or obtain it by keeping the law. The law is not of faith. Let me say it another way. Anytime that you try to make sure you do everything right, anytime that you depend upon you and what you do, okay, as far as how you live holy and all these kind of things, you got to dot the I and cross the T's. You got to do everything exactly right. See, that's not of faith. That's the law. That has nothing to do with faith. But in order to obtain a promise, you have to do it by faith. Because you can't get the promise through the law. The promise is connected to faith. The law is connected to works. Faith, listen to me, faith is never connected to law. Zero. Nada. But if you want to experience the promises of God, it'll be by faith. It'll be through faith. But it's not the law. So when you try to put the law on people, when you try to put the pressure on them to perform and be at their best, the devil will always use that against you. That's why Paul said we were enemies in our own mind by our wicked works. In other words, we became our own worst enemy because when we look at ourselves in the flesh and we depend upon our goodness and our good behavior to qualify ourselves to experience being an heir of the world, to rule and reign in this life, if we're going to do it by the law, we'll never make it, because the law is not of faith. Matter of fact, if you're going to do it that way, listen to this. He says, Jesus is of no effect to you. In other words, he's not going to be any good for you or unto you. That is powerful, powerful, powerful. And see, that's something we need to understand when we teach on faith. And that's what the Lord wanted me to share with you. Listen, God never wanted you under the pressure. God has never wanted you to look at you. Paul said this in 2 Corinthians 5:16, we're to know no man by the flesh. Even Jesus, we're to know him by the Spirit and who we are in the Spirit and our connection with him and our identification with him. That's where our focus is. Because there's promises in the Bible, and there's a lot of promises that concern you and me. That's why I heard a minister years ago, he says, what promise are you standing on? What scripture are you standing on? People come and to get prayed for, and they have needs, and they have things in their life. And listen, we want to pray for each other. And the scripture tells us to pray one for another. But when we get in agreement, like the Bible tells us to, what are we agreeing upon? What kind of promise do we have? Because in order for us to have the promise, faith is going to have to connect to that promise. But we're not going to put any confidence in that promise if we're looking at ourselves, making sure that we're under the law to make sure that we qualify. No, it's going to be by faith.